The US Attorney General has appointed a new figure to head up investigations into the alleged links between Team Trump and Russia. Former FBI chief Robert Mueller, who ran the agency under George Bush, has been named special counsel and will now lead the inquiry. Donald Trump, though, has said he's confident that the investigation will confirm that his team did not collude with any foreign entity in the run-up to last year's election. But that hasn't stopped the growing calls for his impeachment.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to call for the impeachment of the President of the United States of America. There is a belief in this country that no one is above the law, and that includes the President of the United States of America.
Most of the calls about impeachment were made after anonymous sources reporting or leaking something to the nationwide papers and TV stations in America. So it is this time. The impeachment scenario is revolving around the reports by anonymous sources to a number of outlets in the United States that the fired director of the FBI, James Comey, reportedly was told by Trump in a memo which nobody has seen so far, that Comey had to drop the investigation of Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. But again, this is coming from unnamed sources, leakers, whatever you want to call them. So what about Trump himself, how he has been reacting to this? For the first time since the FBI memo allegations came out, he had this to say.
Look at the way I've been treated lately, especially by the media. No politician in history, and I say this with great surety, has been treated worse or more unfairly.
The US Senate Commission has held a special hearing on the supposed Russian military threat in Europe. Caleb Maupin has the details.
Well, it's another day here in the United States, and we're hearing more baseless accusations against Russia. Now, these accusations are getting rather serious. In the testimony this morning, we heard accusations that Russia is threatening its neighbors with nuclear weapons.
Russian aggression is not a localized phenomenon. It threatens the entire region. Moscow has seized sovereign territory by force, threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons against other countries, harassed U.S. and allied military assets, and abandoned key transparency measures and commitments. These actions are absolutely unacceptable.
That's certainly taking the conflict to a whole new level. Talk of allegations that Russia is somehow threatening its neighbors with nuclear weapons. Now, interestingly, though, we did hear some testimony that seemed to highlight that Russia is not exactly the main aggressor here.
NATO members have held over 1,000 military exercises in Europe.
The United States should immediately begin research, which is legally permitted by the treaty, into the development of an intermediate-range missile that would match Russia's new capability.
Now, it seems like thousands of troops and tanks on Russia's border is just not enough, and America wants to come up with new ways to punish Russia for something that hasn't even yet been proven.
The United States and the European Union should continue to put political and economic pressure on the Kremlin.
The U.S. should consider suspending its compliance with the NATO-Russia Founding Act so long as Russia continues to violate its basic principles. The United States should restrict Russian access to U.S. territory until Moscow returns to compliance.
Japanese broadcaster NTV has reported that a ferry from the DPRK arrived in the Russian port city of Vladivostok on Thursday morning. The vessel reportedly left from the Rajin port in the Rason Special Economic Zone on the northeastern tip of the country. It's expected to carry passengers and cargo between the two countries on a weekly basis. The service begins amid outcry from the international community over the DPRK's ongoing missile and nuclear programs.
European Union defence ministers have been meeting in Brussels to debate how to strengthen Europe's defence and security, as well as working better with and within the NATO military alliance. The EU's foreign policy chief says cooperation is key.
Investing together, this is the best way to have an efficient European defence. It's a way of having a rational and efficient joint manner of working on defence. The European Union member states need to overcome the fragmentation in this field and use all the instruments we have in our union.
Improving cooperation with NATO was also discussed, with the head of the alliance saying it is at new high levels.
We are making progress step by step in many different areas to strengthen the practical cooperation between NATO and the European Union. Cooperation between NATO and the European Union will also be an important issue we will highlight when NATO leaders meet exactly in 1 week from now in Brussels.
That's the first alliance meeting attended by President Donald Trump, who's pushing for a bigger role for NATO fighting so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, something resisted by France and Germany. Stoltenberg also said in the face of increasing cyber threats, NATO and the European Union have stepped up their sharing of information on events like the recent ransomware attack.
For a small city-state of 5.7 million people, Singapore has one of the most sophisticated militaries in Asia. And not only that, it produces some of the most technologically advanced military equipment in the world. Some feel that drive for a strong military is rooted in history. The Imperial Japanese Army invaded in 1942 and occupied Singapore for 3 years. But a few decades later, just after independence, Singapore started a secret alliance with another nation. That led to its military buildup and arms industry.
They looked around the world and very quickly realized that Israel was in similar strategic circumstances, that it was a small country surrounded by a large number of potential enemies. So Singapore and Israel covertly formed a close relationship.
This led to Singapore's first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's ideology: make his country like a poisoned prawn, unattractive for the bigger fish the neighboring countries to eat. And that came through military might.
Singapore looks at that threat calculus in the region and will contend that it needs to ensure technological superiority and a very diverse and mature inventory, and it's done that very successfully.
And a great deal of that success is produced by ST Engineering. It started out as a defense contractor manufacturing ammunition for the Singaporean military. Now it's a massive conglomerate with 22,000 employees around the world. But its ties to the government run deep. Both the Navy and ST Engineering turned 50 this year. The Singapore government is its largest stakeholder. It makes $6 billion a year through contracts like building ships for Oman's Navy and armored personnel carriers for the British Ministry of Defense. Self-reliance is very important for Singapore, putting a premium on national defense. With the arms industry here, they've been able to do that and make good money in the process.
He may not be president, but he's by far Iran's most influential political figure. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei could make or break the presidential election. Born in Mashhad in northern Iran, Ali Khamenei studied religion in the holy city of Qom. While there, he became involved in protests against the monarchy and was imprisoned several times by Iran's security services. He was a key figure in the 1979 revolution and quickly rose through the ranks. He went on to become Secretary of Defense and was elected president twice in 1981 and 1985. Although not considered one of Iran's top clerics, he succeeded Iran's first supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, in 1989. A hardline conservative, he's taken a hard stance towards Israel and the United States.
The U.S. use money and sex to try to infiltrate Iran. The main targets are the elites, influential people, and decision makers.
As supreme leader, Khamenei has the power to select members of the Guardian Council, which is in charge of supervising elections and vetting candidates. That has allowed him to influence past presidential elections. He's been very critical of reformist President Hassan Rouhani and has publicly endorsed his conservative rival Ibrahim Raisi. The election comes at a critical time for Iran. Ali Khamenei underwent prostate surgery in 2014 and is thought to be gravely ill. In the event of his death, the next president could play a crucial role in the appointment of his successor, who will be chosen by the so-called Council of Experts.
Their worldly belongings piled high and shepherding the animals that are their livelihood. These people are fleeing their villages around Raqqa as fighting picks up. Black veils litter the floor, abandoned by women who have been forced to wear them by the Islamic State group.
They wanted to cover us, to suffocate us. Whenever anyone did anything they didn't like, they'd slit their throats.
Now, homeless, they must wait. Wait for an alliance of Kurdish and Arab fighters to take back the area, controlled by the Islamic State group for more than 3 years. In an effort to isolate the group's self-proclaimed capital in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces have seized 350 square kilometers in the past week. Backed by US coalition airstrikes and supplied with new weapons from the United States, the SDF has been encircling Raqqa since November. Last week, its fighters managed to retake Tabqa and a strategic dam nearby, some 50 kilometers west of the jihadist stronghold. At its closest point, the SDF is just 4 kilometers from Raqqa and expects to launch its offensive by early summer. Some 4,000 Islamic State group fighters are thought to be holed up in the city, preparing themselves for the anticipated assault.
A new UNICEF report reveals that the number of refugee and migrant children travelling alone has reached a record high. The number of unaccompanied children has increased by nearly 5 times since 2010 to at least 300,000. The report says 92% of minors who arrived in Italy in 2016 did so without an adult.
Our experience of working on the ground in North Africa, in Central America, in parts of Asia, in parts of Europe like Italy, Greece, Bulgaria, all of these different countries, that there are many children that aren't counted, and therefore the number of 300,000, which is this 5-fold increase, is probably the tip of an iceberg.
The timing of this report is not accidental. With the G7 meeting in Italy next week, UNICEF are calling on governments to address the problem and adopt their 6-point plan, which says the best protection for children is efforts to keep families together.
On Thursday, the United Nations said up to 200,000 more people potentially could flee Mosul as Iraqi forces continue to push into the last district still held by Islamic State militants. Since security forces opened a new front against militants in Mosul earlier this month, authorities and aid agencies are already struggling to cope with surging displacement. Lise Grande, the UN's humanitarian coordinator for Iraq, said in a statement, "The numbers of people who are moving are now so large it's becoming more and more difficult to ensure civilians receive the assistance and protection they need." Since the start of the campaign last October, nearly 700,000 people have fled Mosul, seeking refuge with either friends and relatives or in camps.
A mosque in a rundown Paris suburb is set to reopen after being closed during a crackdown on religious extremism. Jihadists had prayed there before leaving to fight in Syria. Charlotte Dubensky has the story.
This mosque was closed as part of France's state of emergency because a number of the men who came to pray here then went to fight for ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Now, many mosques were closed and were told that they couldn't reopen until that had ended. This mosque has been given permission to reopen, and that's causing some concern here in northern Paris.
I'm worried about the mosque because my cousin once told me about it. My daughter hears a lot about these things, but we don't know if it's true or not.
I haven't lived in this area for long. I know there have been some problems here over the last few months, but that's the case all over France. Of course we are worried, and we are against this sort of thing.
I try not to think too much about it because if we constantly think about terrorism and put pressure on the mosques, that would be bad.
I think that people who commit acts of terrorism don't go to the mosque and don't want it here either. I don't think the mosque is the problem.
We should keep a close eye on it. Actually, yes, I am worried. There are people who went to join Daesh, and that's worrying for this town.
Many people say that as the state of emergency in France is still ongoing and the country has been subjected to so many terror attacks, mosques like this shouldn't be opened until the country itself gets the all clear.
Now, with concerns growing over the extent of right-wing extremism in the German army, the country's defence minister has said that military barracks honouring Nazi-era officers should be renamed. However, she has been criticised by many in the country's parliament for not doing enough to tackle the problem.
The current problem is dramatic, Mrs. Minister. You've destroyed trust through your misleading remarks. It's got even worse in the meantime. You're responsible for a culture of distrust within the armed forces.
You, Mrs. von der Leyen, who has been in office as a minister for almost 4 years, you are responsible for it. You are taking measures only now, following enormous public pressure. It's very late, and it's shameful.
Well, there are almost 300 suspected far-right extremists in the German military, according to the country's defence ministry. One particularly well-known case is that of Franco A., who allegedly has a history of expressing anti-immigrant views. He's accused of posing as a refugee and planning a so-called false flag attack with the intention of blaming it on migrants. His case has led German officials to begin rechecking asylum applications, and on Thursday it was reported that the country's immigration officials found errors, in fact, in 10 to 15% of the cases they had reviewed. A closed parliamentary hearing has been held on the matter. Germany's immigration chief didn't confirm the figures, but noted that mistakes were found.
The first results of the examination confirmed that blatant mistakes were made at all stages of the asylum procedure, from application to decision-making.
Meanwhile, the statistics do say that the number of first-time asylum applicants in Germany almost doubled between 2015 and 2016, as Chancellor Merkel's open-door policy welcomed those fleeing conflict into the country.
Germany is ready to help. Anyone can see this. Together, we will do everything to show that Germany helps where help is needed.
Over the last few weeks, these signs have appeared all over Hungary. It says, "Stop Brussels." It may seem odd that Hungary seems to hate the home of the European Union so much, if you consider that every single big piece of infrastructure, the roads, for example, the bridge over the Danube, the metro under Budapest, it's all paid for with European money.
One can conclude that Hungary lives on European Union funding. Without European Union funding, we would experience an economic depression.
The European Union is gradually losing its patience with Hungary. The human rights violations over the refugees, the vicious campaign against the financier George Soros and the university he funds, the new campaign against non-governmental organisations paid for by European donors. It's also widely claimed that much European funding to Hungary is siphoned off by businessmen with links to the ruling Fidesz party, which simultaneously condemns the European Union.
The EU has no tools to deal with this because when the system was designed, they didn't consider that in a few years Hungary would become a gangster state from the top down. The theft of European money is the biggest fraud in the history of Hungary.
The Philippines has told the European Union it will no longer accept the bloc's financial aid. The EU ambassador to the Philippines did not elaborate on the decision, but said May 17th it means the country will lose around 250 million euros worth of grants. President Rodrigo Duterte has criticized the EU in the past for so-called interference in his violent anti-drug campaign after the EU warned the Philippines about human rights violations. In October, Duterte told the EU, "If you think it's time for you guys to withdraw your assistance, go ahead. We will not beg for it." According to Reuters, the move comes after Duterte secured billions of dollars in pledges from China while attending the Belt and Road Summit in Beijing this week. The EU is expected to issue an official statement on Thursday, ending its funding to the Philippines.
The latest nationwide strike in Greece continues to cripple services and coincides with MPs preparing to vote on yet another austerity package. The new measures being proposed include proposing an access to an €86 billion bailout tranche, a staggering 13th pensions cut since 2010, as well as a reduction to income tax-free allowances. And it's perhaps easy to see why the public's against more austerity. Unemployment right now is at 25%. And nearly half of young people in Greece are out of work right now. Protests in Athens turned violent on Wednesday on the eve of the vote.
Police fire tear gas at protesters as near daily clashes continue in Venezuela. Scores of people have been killed since demonstrations against President Nicolas Maduro began last month. In the western state of Táchira, trucks and cars have been destroyed by rioters. Police stations have been set ablaze and military outposts attacked with firebombs. There's also been widespread looting.
They took everything. Cash registers, refrigerators, products that were for sale.
The government says it's sending extra resources to the region to try to quell the violence.
I've already ordered 2,000 National Guard troops and another 600 Special Operations troops to be sent to Táchira to implement this second phase of this response.
Anti-government protests have been continuing elsewhere as health workers took to the streets of the capital, Caracas. There's been a sharp rise in national infant and maternal mortality rates. Doctors blame President Maduro for an economic crisis that's caused food and medicine shortages.
Well, let's take you to Egypt now, where Muslims are anticipating the start of the holy month of Ramadan at the end of May. Now, food and decoration preparations are beginning to take shape, but Ramadan comes at a tough time this year as many countries are forced to adopt austerity measures. Yasser Hakim has more.
The holy month of Ramadan is a time where Muslims are fasting most of the day. But ironically, it's the month that Egyptians actually eat more than usual. Last year's figures show consumption of food during Ramadan was 15% more than the rest of the year.
This is normal because the families and friends gather every day of the month and eat together in a feast atmosphere, so consumption is more.
Prices always tend to increase before the month because of higher demand. But this year it's even worse. The country is already suffering from record high inflation levels, hitting 32% after the floating of the Egyptian pound. And the people are feeling the heat.
The prices are really tough on us. Traders are greedy and we are suffering. The government is working on it, but the prices are too high.
CNN has reported that India's Supreme Court decided Thursday to defer decisions on the controversial Islamic divorce practice known as triple talaq. The practice that stretches back over 1,000 years allows a husband to divorce his wife by simply saying the Arabic word for divorce, talaq, 3 times. India's Supreme Court has convened a special summer session to hear the much-anticipated case. A verdict could have come as early as Friday, but the Supreme Court announced Thursday it was reserving judgment in the contentious court case. India has the world's second-largest Muslim population, but unlike other countries with significant Muslim populations such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, has yet to outlaw triple talaq.
Doctors and parents could face up to 15 years in prison if found guilty of genital mutilation, thanks to a new legislation approved by the Michigan Senate. The legislation, which now goes to the State House of Representatives, was spurred by the case of an emergency room physician charged last month under federal law with performing genital mutilation on 2 7-year-old girls at a suburban Detroit medical clinic. Genital mutilation of girls, typically involving removal of all or part of the clitoris, is banned by several international treaties but remains a common cultural or religious practice in some African countries.
Health officials and aid workers are heading to a remote corner of the Democratic Republic of Congo to respond to an outbreak of Ebola virus disease. However, a key question remains: will the government authorize the use of an experimental vaccine? The formula had stunning results in a clinical trial in Guinea in 2015, but has yet to be licensed for broad use. DRC officials are weighing use of the vaccine, while new details emerge about the outbreak, which so far includes 20 suspected cases and 3 deaths.